Imagine a killer so meticulous, so careful that even decades later investigators are still. For ruthless murderers terrorized their communities, leaving behind horrifying crime scenes and unanswered questions. And each one had a very distinct method, a chilling pattern of violence, and a haunting ability to evade capture. And despite years of investigation, shifting theories, and modern forensic advancements, the identities remain a mystery. Were these crimes the work of singular, calculating individuals, or is there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Today we explore four of the most perplexing unsolved serial murder cases, killers who disappeared into the shadows and perhaps are still out there. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume. And I know you do too, you sick, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And today we are doing just that. We are talking about serial killers that have evaded capture and that could possibly be still out there, which is absolutely horrifying. And that's why I'm telling you today, cause I want you to be safe, my little baby girl. I want you to be safe, okay? If you're a 40-year-old man watching this, I'm calling you baby girl as well. Alright, so without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into these four unsolved murder, serial killer cases together. Alright, before I get started, I need to put on my freaking glasses because I can't see. Gather around because now is Chris Red Screens Wow. Oakland County, Michigan, 1976. Tree-lined suburban streets stretched across affluent communities north of Detroit, where children played freely in the parks and rode bicycles without supervision. You know, the good old days. Not that I was alive back then. The area embodied middle-class American security, well-maintained homes with manicured lawns, good schools, and a pervasive sense of safety that would soon become shattered. And during this period, before cellular phones and instant communication and the interwebs, children regularly ventured out until dusk, expected to return home when the streetlights illuminated. And this environment of perceived safety created the perfect hunting ground for a predator who would eventually launch what became the largest manhunt in US history at the time, involving a task force that would process over 18,000 tips and interrogate more than 15 suspects. So in the quiet suburban neighborhoods of Oakland County, Michigan, a chilling series of events unfolded between 1976 and 1977 that would forever change the community's sense of security. The area, known for its affluent neighborhoods and family-friendly atmosphere, became the hunting ground for one of America's most methodical child killers. And the nightmare would begin on February 15, 1976, when 12-year-old Mark Stebbins left the American Legion Hall in Ferndale. What should have been a routine walk home turned into an irreversible tragedy. 4 days after his disappearance, Mark's body would be discovered in a Southfield parking lot, carefully arranged on a pile of wooden dirt. And the autopsy revealed a disturbing level of premeditation, which is essentially planning the murder before it happened. Mark had been strangled and said with a foreign object, and the rope marks on his wrist and ankles indicated he had been bound during his captivity, while the lacerations on his head suggested violent trauma. Just a real special place in the depths of the asshole of hell for the person that did this. It's just sickening. And obviously police would investigate, but they would come up with nothing. And less than a year later, on December 22nd, 1976, and other families' world would collapse when 12-year-old Jill Robinson left home after arguing with her mother. Her bicycle was recovered behind a hobby store the following day, but Jill herself remained missing until December 26th, when her body was discovered alongside Interstate 75 in Troy. And perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that she had been cared for during the 3 days before her murder, still wearing her backpack and fully clothed when found. So the killer was obviously a fucking monster, but there was a side of him that had remorse for these kids, or felt like he still needed to treat them like kids, like actually care for them. But it's just like it's not even like in the realm of okay. There's no like, oh, that's kind of no, he literally killed these kids. So when the pattern continued on January 2nd, 1977, when 10-year-old Christine Mihalik vanished after visiting a 7-Eleven store. And her ordeal lasted 19 days before her body was recovered on a rural road in Franklin Village. The killer had smothered Christine less than 24 hours before the placement of her body, which was positioned very carefully within view of nearby homes, a signature of the perpetrator's methodical approach. He wanted these kids to be found. The premeditation and planning before these murders is just like insane, like he thought about how he was going to do it, when he was going to do it, and exactly how they were going to be found, and probably when they were going to be found as well. And the final confirmed victim, 11-year-old Timothy King, disappeared on March 16, 1977 during a trip to a local pharmacy. And when found 6 days later in a shallow ditch along Gill Road in Livonia, Timothy had been set with a foreign object as well as the first victim, and also suffocated. And most disturbingly, he had been fed Kentucky Fried Chicken, his favorite meal, shortly before his death. So it's like the killer is trying to make up for everything that he did at the end of it, just thinking that that's gonna wipe his slate clean and in any way, shape, or form, when it's obviously not the case. He deserves to be, well, maybe I shouldn't say what he deserves, cause I'm thinking a lot of things and I don't think I could legally say it on the internet, but what distinguished these murders from other serial killers was the meticulous attention paid to the victims. Each body was found in public areas, meticulously cleaned and dressed, and the unnerving level of care to the perpetrator being dubbed the babysitter killer. And despite the different causes of death, investigators linked the cases through consistent physical evidence, including golden carpet fibers and white animal hair found on all the victims' clothing. Those golden carpet fibers and white animal hair would lead investigators down a very disturbing path directly to a network of wealthy individuals with it, connections to child exploitation. Just the fucking scum of the earth. And as detectives pursued these forensic clues, they uncovered a case far more complex than a lone predator, suggesting the possibility of powerful figures working to ensure certain suspects remain beyond the reach of justice. Just corrupt fucking bullshit. So Christopher Busch emerged as one of the most compelling suspects in the investigation. The son of a wealthy General Motors executive, Busch had already been convicted as a pedophile and maintained connections to an organized child porn network operating in North Fox Island, and the timing proved particularly suspicious. Police had questioned Busch shortly before Timothy King's abduction, and more disturbingly, evidence would link him to a child exploiting ring run by Francis Sheldon, suggesting access to vulnerable children through an established network, which is just like mind-boggling and horrifying to think about. And it's something that happens every day and that people turn a blind eye to too. And it's just so horrifying cause it happens in other countries, but it is also happening in our backyards. So I think it's an important topic no matter what. And in November 1978, investigators discovered Busch dead from what appeared to be suicide. Just easy way out piece of shit. And the scene raised immediate red flags. Blood-stained ropes lay nearby and a hand-drawn image resembling victim Mark Stebbins hung on his wall. And the suspicious circumstances intensified when the entire Oakland County Task Force disbanded just days after Busch's death, having exhausted a $2 million budget. And some investigators later suggested his death may have been staged to prevent him from revealing accomplices of Power associates, which sounds right to me. Yet the case against Busch collapsed in 2012 when DNA testing excluded him as a contributor to biological evidence found on the victims that you didn't expect. And this forensic setback occurred despite the wealth of circumstantial evidence pointing to his involvement, which I still think he was involved in some way. Absolutely. Other suspects presented equally promising yet ultimately inconclusive leads. Ted Lamorgine, I know, a Detroit auto worker. I know, who operated a pedo ring in the Cass corridor during the same period, became a primary suspect in 2005. Convicted murderer Richard Lawson implicated Lamorgine during an interview, but when offered a plea deal to reduce his sentence in exchange for taking a polygraph regarding the Oakland County murders, Lamorgine refused. Just scum of the earth. And DNA evidence brought investigators to convicted pedophile Arch Sloan in 2012 when forensic testing revealed that hairs found on the victim's matched hair, recovered from Sloan's vehicle. And curiously, the DNA didn't match Sloan himself, suggesting someone who had been in his car, or that he let borrow his car for nefarious murderous reasons. But perhaps most telling was James Vincent Gunnels, who had actually been said by Christopher Busch as a teenager. and forensic testing found his DNA potentially matched a hair on victim Christine Michalik, though the statistical probability being only 1 to 150 proved too low for conclusive identification, and Guttles has consistently denied any involvement. So time marched relentlessly forward while justice stood still. And nearly 5 decades after the horrific killings that terrorized Oakland County, the case remains unsolved despite remarkable advances in forensic technology. And for Timothy King's father, Barry, the quest for answers became his life's mission, which, like, how could it not, being a parent, you know? I just like Ugmy, just like Ugmy. Her just goes out to all these families. And this journey unfortunately ended in 2020 when he passed away without ever learning who murdered his son. And the systemic investigative failures point to disturbing possibilities. An exceptionally meticulous killer who left minimal evidence. Protection of connected individuals through institutional interference, or fundamental errors in the initial investigation that can never be remedied. But whatever the truth, the Oakland County child killer case stands as a sobering reminder that even with extensive resources, justice remains tragically elusive, for some victims leaving their families to endure the cruelest of uncertainties. But my heart goes out to the victims and the victims' families, and whoever did this, I hope you're rotting in hell. Let's move on. Glasgow, Scotland in the late 1960s was experiencing the cultural upheaval common throughout Western societies at the time. The city's working-class population found escape at venues like Barrel and Ballroom, a popular dance hall where young people gathered to socialize. And against this backdrop, a series of murders began on February 22nd, 1968, when 25-year-old Patricia Ocker attended the ballroom. And the young nurse and mother left the venue alone and was discovered the following morning in a doorway near Langside Place, strangled and partially clothed, and her personal belongings missing from the scene completely. And Patricia Ocker balanced complex responsibilities as her life was cut short. The 25-year-old auxiliary nurse managed night shifts while caring for her 4-year-old son Sandy during a period of separation from her husband, who served with Rath in Lincolnshire. And on that fateful February evening in 1968, Patricia told her parents she was visiting the Majestic Ballroom, but instead went to Barrel and known for its over 25 nights where attendees often removed wedding rings seeking temporary anonymity from their complicated lives. Some shady shit going on in the 60 seconds, I tell you what. But Patricia would go to the ballroom and leave and then obviously lose her life, which is extremely horrible, but would lead us to our second victim, which would be Jemima MacDonald. And Jemima maintained a household as a single mother to 3 children: Elizabeth, who was 11 years old, Andrew, who was 8 years old, and Dallin, who was 7. Described by acquaintances as clean and well cared for, Jemima ensured her children were properly looked after despite the challenges of sole parenthood. And her murder in August of 1916 fractured the family unit she had worked so hard to maintain. And the aftermath proved additionally devastating as her 3 children were separated and placed in different care homes, causing a secondary tragedy that extended beyond the initial death. So heartbreaking. And then we have Helen Pritchard. Now Helen Pritchard would be the final victim. And she had recently returned to Glasgow with her husband George, an army serviceman, and their 2 young sons David and Michael. And the night of her murder in October 1916 represented a rare evening of personal freedom, a brief respite from maternal obligations while her husband would remain home with her children. And the cruel irony that Helen was killed steps away from the domestic safety she had temporarily left behind underscores the tragedy's senselessness. But all 3 women shared significant commonalities beyond their connection to Barrel land. Each was a mother seeking brief independence from their demanding domestic responsibilities. And the over 25's night at Barrel and offered a socially acceptable outlet for married women to experience autonomy in an era of limited freedom. And perhaps most significantly, each was menstruating at the time of death, which is just so odd, but a biological detail that potentially influenced the killer's victim selection. Maybe the bright lights of Glasgow's Barrel and Ballroom concealed a methodical predator whose selection process went beyond mere opportunism. This venue, where married patrons often removed their wedding rings for anonymous encounters, provided the perfect hunting ground for a killer. His approach suggested calculated religious motivations rather than random violence. So he was seeking these people out, specifically people who were set out to be unfaithful to their partners. He didn't like that, not one bit. So when investigators initially focused on the Majestic Ballroom rather than the barrel and following Patricia Acker's murder, they inadvertently compromised crucial evidence collection during the critical early hours of the investigation. And this error would prove significant as the pattern of barrel and connections became apparent, with subsequent victims and witnesses consistently described the suspect as exceptionally well-dressed and articulate attributes that distinguished him from a typical violent offender. His polite, charming demeanor allowed him to gain trust of women at the venue, facilitating their willingness to leave with him. So this calculated approach indicated premeditation rather than impulsive violence. This man was a hunter, and the religious underpinnings of the crime emerged most clearly during Helen Puttock's taxi journey, where her sister Jean Langford heard the suspect quote scripture and condemn the barrel land as a den of iniquity. And Jean further recalled that he mentioned he did not drink but prayed instead, suggesting a strict religious upbringing that would later contribute to his infamous moniker. And forensic examinations revealed a disturbing ritualistic element. At each crime scene, the deliberate positioning of sanitary items near the victim's body indicated the killers harbored specific fixations possibly connected to biblical notions of impurity. And this consistent pattern, combined with the strangulation method employed in each murder, pointed to a signature that evolved while maintaining core elements, potentially indicating the killer's growing confidence or adaptation to avoid detection. This guy was unfortunately smart and extremely calculated and extremely fucking judgmental to consenting adults. And as the ritualistic elements at the crime scene became clear, Glasgow police mobilized in unprecedented numbers. What began as a standard murder investigation transformed into Scotland's most extensive manhunt yet. It would ultimately fail despite groundbreaking tactics and compelling witness testimony. And the investigation pioneered forensic techniques never before seen in Scottish policing. Most notably, authorities created and widely distributed the nation's first police photo fit of a suspect in a murder case, plastering newspapers and television broadcasts with the composite image. And the manhunt scope was extraordinary, with undercover officers dispatched to blend among barrel and patrons in what the press dubbed as Marine Formation Dance Team, which is pretty awesome. Plainclothes detectives scanning the dance floor for anyone matching the suspect's description. In Jean Langford's account for the taxi ride with her sister Helen, the suspect provided investigators with extraordinary detail, a mixed blessing that just shaped the entire investigation. And while her testimony offered first-hand description of the killer's appearance, mannerisms, and religious rhetoric, over-reliance on her singular account potentially narrowed the investigation aperture, causing detectives to dismiss leads that didn't precisely match her recollection, which is damaging in investigations. I mean, obviously it's good to have that testimony, but I mean, we're not built to remember somebody perfectly, it needs to be broader than that. And we know that now, but that was all they had, so that is what they went for. And the undercover operation at Barrel and continued for months until late October 1916, when it was abruptly terminated. And the cessation came not from any investigative breakthrough, but due to complaints from proprietors about plummeting attendance figures as patrons avoided the venue, now associated with a serial killer. Basically just cause a bunch of people were just bummed that other people got killed and it ruined their fucking swinger party. I guess cause that matters more than solving people's murders. I don't know. Decades later, in 1996, investigators exhumed the body of John Irvine McInnes for DNA testing, a costly operation that yielded inconclusive results and triggered substantial media backlash. And more troubling revelations emerged in 2022 when the BBC podcast Bible John creation of a serial killer alleged that McInnes may have been protected due to the familial connections with a senior officer involved in the original investigation. And just corruption everywhere. But in exhuming John's body, it would give this serial killer the name Bible John, mixing the scripture with the murders of this is just what it became, but it's not conclusive. And even convicted murderer Peter Tobin fell under suspicion due to the striking similarities in methods and victimoglia, but was ultimately eliminated because records confirmed he wasn't in Glasgow during the murders. So we're left with another unsolved serial murder case. And hopefully this bastard is fucking dead. But that brings us to our next killer. So in the mid-92nd, the Belgian city of Mons became the backdrop for a series of gruesome discoveries. Women began vanishing without a trace, only for their dismembered remains to surface in garbage bags across rivers and roads with unsettling names like Pathodov, Warriand H River. And the precision of the cuts and the eerie choice of disposal sites pointed to a methodical and deeply disturbed killer. And despite the formation of dedicated task force, the investigation was plagued with mismanagement, lack of resources, and dead end leads. And as the body count grew, so did the mystery. Was the killer a lone predator, a trained professional, or something even more sinister? And over the years, investigators pursued multiple suspects, some with disturbing ties to similar crimes, but as time passed, justice slipped further away, leaving behind a chilling question: who was the Butcher of Mons and why was he never caught? So in January of 1996, a pattern of disappearances began that would haunt the Belgian city of Mons for years to come. Carmelene Rousseau, a 42-year-old woman, vanished after visiting her imprisoned son on January 4th. And her disappearance might have remained just another missing persons case, but 17 days later, fishermen made a grim discovery in the Scheldt River, northern France. And it would be Rousseau's pelvis which was deliberately severed from the rest of her body. And this would just mark the beginning of a series of methodical dismembered victims. And 6 months later, Martine Bona, 43-year-old former sexual worker, disappeared on July 21st, and her dismembered torso was subsequently recovered from the Haine River. And investigators noted a particularly disturbing detail: her breasts had been deliberately removed from her body, suggesting a sexual motivation behind the killer's methodology. Just a fucking monster. And the precision of these cuts initially led authorities to consider medical training as a prerequisite for the predator, which would make sense, or some sort of board. Butcher somebody who's worked with bodies before. And the pattern would continue into December when Jacqueline Leclerc, a 33-year-old mother of four, went missing on the 22nd. And unlike the previous victims, her remains weren't discovered until March of the following year, when Officer Olivier Mach recovered garbage bags containing her severed arms and legs. And the delay between disappearances and discovery raised questions about the killer's storage capabilities, and by March 1997, 21-year-old Natalie Goddard became the fourth, though not involved in sexual work. Investigators noted she had been described as promiscuous and was struggling with personal issues severe enough that her child had actually been placed in protective care. And her torso was recovered from the same waterway as Bones remains, the Haine River. And the killer's final known victim would be Begonia Valencia, a 37-year-old woman with schizophrenia who disappeared from during the summer of 1997. And only her skull would be recovered in the area of Hyen's adjusting and evolution in disposal methods or decomposition that prevented further remains from being located. He was just getting a lot better at hiding the remains. Forensic analysis would reveal disturbing detail that investigators initially overlooked. The preservation state of various body parts differed significantly. Some remains appeared relatively fresh, while others showed evidence of refrigeration, indicating the killer likely stored dismembered parts for extended periods before the actual disposal. And this suggested both access to suitable refrigeration facilities and a disturbing level of planning. And perhaps most chilling was the killer's apparent psychological signature in the selection of the disposal sites. Locations with macabre names became favored dumping grounds. Rue des Depots, literally dump street chem in Deal Ongo, is say, which is path of Warriand rivers, with the unsettling names like Haine, which is Hayton Toy, which is jitters. And this deliberate selection of symbolically charged locations suggested a perpetrator who incorporated psychological elements into their methodology. So the symbolically charged disposal sites just reflected a killer with psychological sophistication, yet the Belgian judicial system's response would prove remarkably insufficient. Despite establishing a specialized investigative unit, authorities gradually abandoned their pursuit of the butcher, while dismembered bodies continued to appear throughout the region. And in the aftermath of the killings, Belgian authorities formed the Corpus Investigative Unit under Magistrate Pierre Platt. And this represented the nation's most concentrated efforts to identify and apprehend the methodical killer terrorizing Mons. However, from its inception, the unit faced substantial institutional constraints. Despite the brutality and sophistication of the crimes, Belgian officials classified the case as merely local, failing to allocate adequate resources for what was clearly a complex serial murder investigation. So the systemic dismantling of the investigative effort became evident as years passed without an arrest. And by 2007, what had begun as a substantial team had been reduced to only 4 investigators. And the dramatic reduction occurred even as the unit had examined nearly 1,000 complaints over 13 years, demonstrating a very troubling administrative indifference to solving the case. And the lack of modern forensic techniques available at the time further hampered investigators, limiting their ability to extract DNA evidence or effectively share information across international borders. An investigation eventually developed significant international dimensions in 2007 when Montenegrin authorities arrested Smail to DJA, who emerged as the JA investigators' most compelling suspect. To DJA's crime history included a strikingly similar murder in New York in 1990, where victim Mary Bill was dismembered and placed in garbage bags, a methodology nearly identical to the butcher's signature. And additionally, evidence against DJI included his confirmed presence in Belgium during the Mons murders, his romantic connection to the New York victim, and bloodstain discovered in his apartment. Yet investigators never secured conclusive proof linking him to the Belgian killings. To DJA's death in a Montenegrin prison in 2012 permanently foreclosed any possibility of obtaining a confession or conducting additional DNA comparisons. But good fucking riddance anyway. But other suspects emerged throughout the investigation. Jacques Antoine, a French doctor, became a person of interest after his son wrote letters to police accusing him of carrying black trash bags while living in Mons during the murder period. But these accusations ultimately held very little weight, undermined by inconsistencies and the son's peculiar focus on his father's firearm collection rather than behaviors related to dismemberment. Basically just a kid wanting to get rid of his father. And British citizen John Sweeney, convicted of dismemberment murders in both Amsterdam and London, represented another plausible suspect based on his potential presence in Belgium between his known killings. However, authorities never established a definitive connection between Sweeney and the Mons murders. Just another piece of shit, I guess. But the Butcher of Mons case exposed system failures in Belgian law enforcement, turning a major manhunt into a disjointed, under-resourced investigation. An expert suggests that the killer's meticulous planning skills and possible medical training allowed him to evade capture while preying on society's most vulnerable. And the case's mishandling has fueled discussions on understanding perpetrator psychology and underscored the need for interagency cooperation and proper resource allocation. Though officially unsolved, its legacy has influenced investigative reforms, at least ensuring greater institutional accountability, changes that well too late for the victims may help prevent similar failures in the future. And with that, we move on to our last unsolved serial killer murder case. San Francisco's foggy beaches and secluded parks became the hunting ground for this methodical predator. Ocean Beach, with its desolate stretches of sand shrouded in mist, served as the backdrop for the Doodler's first confirmed murder on January 27, 1974. The body of Gerald Earl Kavanaugh was discovered there bearing multiple stab wounds. The 49-year-old's death marked the beginning of a pattern that would terrorize the city's gay community for 18 months, leaving bodies scattered across Ocean Beach, Golden Gate Park, and Lincoln Park. And the pattern linking these homicides together merged gradually as each new victim was discovered. What began as seemingly unrelated crimes soon revealed a methodical perpetrator with consistent targets and methods. In Kavanaugh's defensive wounds indicated a violent struggle against his attacker, as 17 stab wounds demonstrating a level of aggression that would become a characteristic of the killer's approach. And the investigators initially treated this as an isolated incident, failing to recognize the beginning of a systemic campaign of violence. And only 5 months later, the killer would strike again. Joseph Stevens, known professionally as Jay, was discovered near Spreckles Lake with 5 stab wounds. And the location of his abandoned car suggested he had willingly accompanied his killer to the secluded area of Golden Gate Park, likely anticipating a sexual encounter. And as a performer in San Francisco's nightlife, Stevens represented a more visible target within the gay community. And the brutality escalated drastically with the third victim just 12 days after Stevens' death. so his cooldown period has drastically gotten shorter. Klaus Christmann's body appeared at Ocean Beach. A German visitor suffered what investigators described as an extraordinarily vicious attack, with slashes to his throat so severe they appeared to be an attempt at decapitation. And this marked a significant intensification in the killer's violence. And then nearly a year would pass before Frederick Kappen became the fourth victim. The decorated Vietnam veteran received 16 precisely delivered stab wounds that pierced vital organs, including the heart. Evidence at Ocean Beach revealed his body had been dragged 20 feet through the sand, suggesting the killer was becoming more methodical in positioning his victims. And the final confirmed kill was Harold Goldberg, who was discovered in an advanced state of decomposition on June 4, 1975 at Lincoln Park. And the 66-year-old Swedish-American's body told a different story. He had been dead for approximately 2 weeks and found with his underwear removed and pants unzipped, further confirming the sexual dimension of these crimes. But this wasn't even the end, as police had no clue during the investigation if more bodies turning up truly were from the same murderer or just random acts of violence. But behind the gruesome murders lay a method as distinctive as it was disturbing. The Doodler's artistic talent transformed ordinary bar encounters into deadly traps. His approach demonstrated a calculated precision that set him apart from other killers operating during the same period. The Doodler prowled San Francisco's vibrant gay scene, primarily targeting establishments in Castro Polk Gulch and Tenderloin districts. And popular venues such as Cinch Saloon and Cabaret Club became his hunting grounds, where he implemented his signature strategy. Rather than relying on physical intimidation, he disarmed potential victims through his artistic abilities, sketching portraits of men he encountered as a non-threatening means of introduction. One survivor actually recounted meeting the killer at a diner where he was drawing animals on a napkin, using this talent as a conversation starter. And this deceptively innocent approach allowed him to establish trust with his targets, who would just willingly accompany him to secluded locations, typically near water. And these isolated areas, known as gay hookup spots in the 1970s, provided both privacy for sexual encounters and the perfect setting for murder. And the violence of the attacks just indicated extreme rage, and the positioning of the bodies followed a consistent pattern, with victims discovered in outdoor locations near water. Furthermore, the killer would strip victims of identification, completely making it more difficult for authorities to connect cases and identify the deceased. But 3 individuals survived encounters, with the Doodler providing crucial details about his methodology. A European diplomat suffered 6 stab wounds but managed to escape with his life. And another survivor, described as a well-known entertainer, fled when a knife fell from the attacker's coat, revealing his deadly intentions before an attack could commence. And the 3rd survivor left San Francisco entirely and refused to cooperate with investigators. But the psychological profile that emerged suggested a perpetrator struggling with his own sexual identity. Extraordinary violence directed at gay men indicated possible internalized homophobia, perhaps a person unable to accept his own homosexual desires and projecting that self-hatred onto others, which we've seen in multiple other serial killer cases involving the gay community. And witness descriptions consistently depicted a young black man between 19 and 25 years old, approximately 6 feet tall, who demonstrated both artistic skill and capacity for extreme violence. So the psychological assessment pointing to internalized homophobia took on a disturbing new dimension in late 1975, when a psychiatrist contacted police about a patient who had confessed to the Ocean Beach murders. And this revelation brought investigators tantalizingly close to solving the case, yet the Doodler would ultimately slip through their grasp due to circumstances that reveal as much about 1972's America as they do about the killer himself. The investigation was led by a formidable team: Dorothea Guilford and Earl Sanders, African-American homicide inspectors nicknamed the Soul Brothers, who had earned reputations for their meticulous work. They had constructed a very detailed case file that included a police sketch and narrowing list of suspects. And when the psychiatrist came forward with the information about his patient's confession, investigators believed they had finally identified their perpetrator. These guys look badass, this guy looked badass as fuck, that's awesome. And under questioning, the prime suspect acknowledged his struggles with sexual identity but denied committing the murders completely. And without physical evidence definitively connecting him to the crimes, authorities found themselves in an evidentiary stalemate. The case now hinged entirely on testimony from the 3 survivors who encountered unescaped the Doodler. And the sociopolitista climate of the 1970s created an insurmountable barrier to justice. Basic homosexuality remained classified as a mental illness by American Psychiatric Association until 1973, and the stigma persisted long after declassification. Gay men faced potential loss of employment, housing, and social standing if publicly outed. And for the European diplomat, testimony would have meant career destruction, basically. So their lives were on the line with the Doodler, but also their lives were on the line with the public. And for the entertainer and the well-known survivor, public identification as a homosexual threatened their livelihoods and personal safety and reputations. And relations between law enforcement and the labbed community further complicated matters. Police raids on gay establishments were common practice throughout the 1960s and even early 1970s, fostering a deep institutional distrust. And many gay men viewed police not as protectors but as persecutors, making cooperation with authorities a fraught proposition even where their own safety was at stake. And Harvey Milk, who would later become San Francisco's first openly gay elected official, captured the impossible position of the survivors when he stated, quote, unquote, "I understand their position. I respect the pressure society has put on them." And this acknowledgement from one of the community's most prominent advocates highlighted the devastating reality societal homophobia had effectively granted the Doodler immunity from prosecution, which is just so fucked up. So the serial killer got away with it due to society being shit, basically. Just a big society piece of shit. But despite the advances in forensic science and investigative techniques, these cases remain one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in modern history. The Oakland County child killer Bible, John the Butcher of Mons, and the Doodler each left behind not just a trail of victims, but an enduring sense of unease. Their identities obscured by time, speculation, and incomplete evidence. While theories abound from lone predators to potential conspiracies, justice has never been fully realized for the victims. And as cold cases continue to be revisited with new technology, one pressing question remains: could one of these elusive killers still be alive today, hidden in plain sight? I don't know. But all I do know is that I care about you and I want you to stay safe. So be safe out there, and let me know what other cases you would like me to go over down below. The cold cases are always good, I think, to shine a light on them. You know, you never know who's gonna see, you never know what's gonna happen. But yeah, I'm tired of these people. They're not people, they're monsters. I hope they're rotting in hell. And I hope you're just cozy ed up with some popcorn and a snack or something. But I hope you have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, or night. And I will see your beautiful face in the next video, okay? Stay safe out there. Hi, March 5th, 2023, Mogi das Cruzes, Sao Paulo, Brazil. It was just after dawn on a quiet Sunday, and a man sat outside his sister's house in a calm residential neighborhood because he was visiting for the weekend. And nothing about the scene really stood out until a car slowed down to a stop along the curb. And inside the car were multiple hooded figures whose faces were hidden and whose weapons were ready. And in seconds, they sprang from the vehicle and opened fire. Gunshots just tore through the morning stillness, hitting the man at close range. Then he would collapse on the pavement. No time to react, just riddled with bullets. But it wasn't over cause. One attacker would step forward and, in a final act of brutality, he would slit the man's throat so deep that police later described it as near to execution. Police would also describe it as an execution, a professional hit. And given who the victim was, few were surprised at all, cause this man had made enemies in every corner of the underworld. Men with long memories and violent grudges. So some said it was revenge and others said that it was inevitable because this wasn't just a murder. This was the final chapter in one of Brazil's darkest legends. And the man laying dead now on the sidewalk was once known as Pode Rivenholm Matador. But who really was Pode Rivenholm Matador, and why was he killed? Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And today we are doing just that. We are deep diving into one of the most prolific vigilante serial killers in the world. Actually, the most prolific vigilante serial killer in the world. The kill count is insane, and this guy's backstory is even more insane. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this vigilante serial killer together. Pedro Rodriguez Filho was born on June 17, 1954, and there is some discrepancy on his birth date, so it's either this or October 29, 1950. But alas, he was born in the rural town of Santa Rita dos Apucia, Brazil, and his life would begin in violence caused while still in the womb. Pedro's mother Manuela was kicked in the stomach by her husband Pedro Sr. during one of many brutal beatings. And that kick would leave Pedro with a permanently dented skull, just a physical marker of the rage he was born into. And his father, though insane, worked really hard when sober, but alcohol just turned him into a complete monster prone to explosive rages that terrified the entire household. And Manuela, for her part, ruled the children with an iron fist and a Bible. She was very quick to punish and had no hesitation when it came to beating her sons. So it was kind of like a domino effect in the household. And Pedro was actually the oldest in what ended up being at least 8 siblings, and he took that position very seriously because family was all that the poor had in Brazil, so it was everything to him. And in a home dominated by fear, he believed it was his responsibility to look out for the smaller siblings. So that sense of duty would become central to his whole identity and later his violence. So the family wasn't necessarily starving, but life was really hard because clean water was oft undiverted to the fields and medical care was very scarce, and disease at this point was very rampant, and the poor weren't treated as disposable. And there was only one place that Pedro really felt safe in, that was with his maternal grandparents. His grandfather Joaquim was a butcher and actually taught Pedro how to hunt fish, plant crops, and slaughter animals with great precision. Some foreshadowing for you. And at the butcher shop, Pedro learned how to bone an ox and how to use a blade and just generally how to kill. Some more foreshadowing for you. But Joaquim also tried to instill in Pedro a sense of morality and what it means to be just. He would go on to say, he also taught me how to be worthy, correct, and just man. My grandfather loved me. Of all the grandchildren, I was the dearest. And Pedro's grandmother had her own beliefs. She told him that drinking ox blood would make him strong, and Pedro believed her. And by the time he was 10, Pedro was actually working at a chicken slaughterhouse using the very tools and methods that his grandfather had taught him. And he also hunted monkeys for meat and pelts. He fished and helped provide for his family in any way that he could at the ripe age of 10 years old, no less. Like, what was I doing when I was 10? Man's I doing just like sniffing markers maybe. Yeah, I mean, I was definitely doing that. Don't remember a lot from back then probably, cause I was sniffing markers so much anyway. But the lessons he learned were clear. Survival was earned and justice wasn't given. It had to be taken. And Pedro as a child was very small, weary, but very serious as well, wary. He was a bit of an old soul. And what he lacked in size he made up for with intensity. He was fearless, kind of dangerously so. And he showed early signs of deep sensitivity to injustice, especially when it involved his family. He was like the ultra-final boss empath, if you will, but also not because he ended up people, but you know what I mean. But that sensitivity curdled into something much darker in 1967 when Pedro was only 13 years old. He had taken his cousin's horse for a short ride without permission, just an impulsive act that he really didn't think much of it. He didn't think that his cousin would care, but when his cousin found him, the other boy actually had punched Pedro hard across the face, and Pedro on the ground, and completely dazed from getting basically knocked out, looked up at him and said, "I'm going to kill you." And his cousin laughed and would just proceed to punch him in the face again. Poking the bear, if you will. And Pedro wasn't laughing, and he also didn't forget. So weeks would pass and the cousin wouldn't apologize, and other relatives heard about the incident and kind of mocked Pedro for being weak. Different times. And inside him something began to fester. And this wasn't just anger. It turned into an obsession. And the opportunity for revenge came at the sugar cane mill where Pedro and his cousin were assigned to feed cane stalks into an industrial press, foreshadowing. And the press is basically two giant steel rollers that crush the stalks into a pulp. So Pedro would do his job and also wait for his moment. And then, without any warning, Pedro would shove his cousin into the rollers, and his cousin's arm would get stuck into the press and it would crush it all way up to his shoulder until the machine just completely jammed out. And Pedro, still not being satisfied with this revenge, would proceed to pick up pruning shears and stab his cousin repeatedly, just trying to reduce the body, enough so it could still push through the press. Foul, terrifying. But the attack would be interrupted by workers who heard the screams, and his grandfather turned up just in time to actually turn off the machine before his cousin could get fully pulled into this press. So Pedro would naturally be arrested, but only as a minor, and with pressure from his grandfather, he would actually be released within days. So his only punishment was that he was ordered to clean the machine of the blood and flesh, and that would take him about for weeks. That's not a punishment. If I asked my mom, I would get more of a punishment than that with the... And Pedro later in life would retell the story with just pure amusement, laughing as he described the attack, because he felt no remorse for his cousin, because his cousin had wronged him and he was bringing him to justice. In his mind, the balance had been restored, basically. And with that, Pedro Rodriguez Filho felt his first taste of justice and of something else, to which was pleasure. And the urge to kill had awakened. So in 1968, Pedro was 14 years old, and this is when his life would take an irreversible turn. Because his father, Pedro Sr., had worked as a night janitor at a local school, but was abruptly fired without severance after being accused of stealing food and supplies during his shift. Though Pedro Sr. denied all allegations, his word was dismissed in favor of a daytime guard who claimed Pedro Sr. was responsible for it. And the consequences were devastating for the family, because with his father jobless and branded as a thief, the Rodriguez family spiraled into poverty. And Pedro would watch as his siblings just went hungry, and his mother Manuela cried in silence. And Pedro believed that his father had been wronged, because although Pedro Sr. was kind of a piece of shit, he didn't steal. So Pedro believed that the balance once again needed to be restored and someone had to pay. So Pedro would just retreat into the wilderness armed with a .36 caliber rifle, a machete, and a green army backpack packed. And he built a makeshift camp in the forest. He just went full feral mode. And he would live here for months, surviving off wild game. He's 14 at this time. He's disappeared and started just living off the land, just planning on waiting. Cause this wasn't a retreat. He was just meticulously planning something. And one night, Pedro laid in wait outside the deputy mayor's house, the very man who had authorized his father's dismissal. And when the deputy arrived in the jeep, Pedro raised his grandfather's rifle and fired. And he would shoot the man and he would die instantly. And that's when Pedro would just flee into the dark. And this would be the first man that Pedro had killed, because his cousin didn't die in that incident somehow. I don't know how he didn't die, but he didn't die, but he didn't die, but this would be the first man that he would kill, and he would not be the last. But he said when it was done, he felt no remorse. He felt satisfaction and he felt righteous. But the injustice hadn't been fully avenged at this point. Not yet. Because there was still someone responsible for the pain his family was facing. So he allegedly told himself moving forward he would tell the victims why he was going to kill them. Sound like anybody we know. Tonight's the night. So Pedro would wait for the right time to strike his next victim, and it would be a month later when Pedro returned to the school where his father once worked, and his next target, the day guard, the man he believed had falsely accused Pedro Sr. and ruined his entire family's life. So Pedro would wait outside the storeroom where the guard usually began his shift. So when the man arrived, Pedro would again lift his gun, but he wouldn't shoot just yet. He would actually force the man into a chair, and then he told him exactly why he was going to die, saying, "Did you see what you did? It destroyed my family. My brothers are starving because of you. Is it fair that you did this?" And the guard would just sob and break down and beg for his life, but Pedro wouldn't have it. And he just shot him twice, and then he would pile boxes and furniture over the body and set it all on fire before fleeing the scene once again. Do not wrong this guy, my lord. And he's 14 at this point. So with the authorities now closing in, Pedro just went into hiding, and he would completely flee metropolitans, Apollo taking refuge in a home with his godmother. And it would be there that he met a woman that changed his life. And that woman was Butcher. And Butcher was a widowed drug trafficker known for her beauty, influence, and iron fist of control of a local criminal organization. And she would just take Pedro in, and she would actually become his lover, which I'm not sure of the age of her, but she was definitely a lot older. But she would have a lot of influence over him, and she would actually start to work him in the drug trade. Though Pedro was still a minor, obviously his relationship with Butcher granted him unusual status and power within the gang. But his rise in this power kind of stirred resentment from older traffickers who saw him as just an upstart. And according to one of the rival's girlfriends, Pedro had been targeted for assassination at this point. And after she told Pedro, he constantly kept one eye open. And soon after all this, Pedro would actually be invited to a lagoon supposedly for a swim, just to smoke with the boys. But as they started walking towards the water, Pedro would slowly become more and more suspicious because the others were acting kind of strangely, and they were armed. So Pedro, being Pedro, would pull his gun first, and he would order them to disarm themselves. And instead of listening to the child, they ran away. And that's when Pedro would just light them up. He would open fire, killing two and hospitalizing a third. And whether it was paranoia or legitimate self-defense, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Pedro survived, and now he completely ruled through fear. And from that moment on, Pedro's reputation just exploded. He became known as PE Drive-In Hulk, or Touch Ira, which means Cartridge Pete, which is a reference to his favorite weapon, a two-shot-sawn-off shotgun. And he would work with a trusted pair of partners, Gazan Hohen's AK Da. And the trio would carry out multiple crimes across cities like Yak Era, even double-crossing rival dealers. And Pedro was just known to live on the edge, not to be fucked with, if you will. But he slept in cars, cemeteries, and churches, and he hid from both police and death squads, who were basically notorious vigilante groups made up of off-duty cops who executed suspected criminals with impunity. So he would be doing his thing, living on the edge, doing crime, and then one day karma would get him back and he would be ambushed. And during this ambush, Butcher would be killed and Pedro would be wounded. So Pedro, just shattered and completely in poor health, now sought refuge again with his family, cause he just lost the love of his life, and the person that introduced him to this whole crime world basically groomed him, and he was wounded. So he would seek refuge with his family. But this time his relatives practiced Candomblé Macumba, which is an Afro-Brazilian religion involving spiritual possession and ritual sacrifice, sometimes referred to as black magic. And they put Pedro through a ceremony involving him drinking the blood of a black cat, dancing, drumming, and a ritual burial of the carcass with seeds inside. And a short time later, Pedro would actually go to retrieve the seeds from the buried carcass and wear them as a necklace. And this represented being a spiritual talisman that he believed would make him completely invincible. And he would go on to say, from then on, the cops opened fire, but the bullets didn't hit me. He claimed nothing would stop me. So after this, his crimes would escalate. His methods grew bolder, and he would not just be known as Cartridge Pete. He would be called something new, but only after he had committed his most violent offense to date, something that would turn him into the legend he's known as today. So, after the bloodshed, betrayals, and rituals that had defined his early teens, Pedro would find something very unexpected, and that was love again. And while living in Campo Grande City, just Rio de Janeiro, Pedro met a young woman named Maria Aprestipa de Olimpia. And for the first time, the boy who had killed his way through the slums of Sao Paulo seemed to have a future beyond just vengeance. And Pedro and Maria fell in love, and soon Maria would become pregnant. So they moved into a small shack, and Pedro kept supporting them the only way he knew how, by operating outside the law. So he would continue stealing from corrupt traffickers, robbing from businesses who cheated the poor, and reselling stolen goods to dealers he believed were just. So everything he's doing, even though it's against the law, he's like kind of doing it like Robin Hood. Like anybody that's bad, he would steal from, and then he would steal from, and then would give back where he took dead. So he was like the good bad guy, if you will, the vigilante. And Pedro saw himself as a vigilante and not a criminal. But in his mind, he was doing moral work. He protected the weak, and he punished the wicked, and he provided for the woman he loved and the child they were expecting. But that illusion of peace wouldn't last, because Pedro at this point had made a fuckload of enemies that would not forgive. So one day after work, Pedro would return back to his shack that he shared with his love, and he would find it to be silent. And inside, he would find Maria, his pregnant girlfriend, dead, murdered along with the man Pedro had asked to protect her while he was away. And the scene was horrific because the killer had actually used their blood to write a message for Pedro on the wall saying, "We will get you." And at this point, she had been 7 months pregnant. And at this point, Pedro's life had already been drenched in blood, and now he was just consumed in rage, because now it wasn't just justice he needed to serve. It was fucking personal. So Pedro would set out, and he would spend over a year hunting. He would interrogate anyone he thought might have information. He tortured people who didn't give answers fast enough. But for a long time, he would kind of come up with nothing. And he killed so many, wronged so many, and he no longer knew where to begin. And then one day at a bar, someone would approach him, and it would be a woman. And she said she had actually been looking for him. She was the ex-wife of a man named China, and China was a drug trafficker Pedro had betrayed years earlier, stealing his drugs and guns and selling them off to a rival. And China had never forgotten this. And according to her, China had actually ordered for Maria's murder. And the woman who came up to Pedro in the bar would go on to show him her bruises and scars from China. And Pedro believed her. And she would actually tell him something else, and that was that China's brother is actually getting married that weekend, and she would tell him exactly where. You guys ever heard of the Red Wedding? It's about to get really bad. So Pedro would call up his old allies, Guz and Hohen's a Cape Town, and he would tell them, quote unquote, "We're going to a wedding. Every man there gets a bullet, but if you shoot a woman or child, you'll have to answer to me." Which, listen, I know this guy is a really bad guy, but a straight-up action movie line right there. That, like, pluck that out, put that into a movie. He's a piece of shit, he kills people, but you know, like, that goes hard as a line by itself. So Pedro and his compadres would go to this wedding, and the venue was full, and the guests were drinking and dancing and toasting the groom and bride. And Pedro and his men slipped inside completely undetected. And Pedro would approach the doorman claiming to be an honored guest of China. And moments later, Pedro spotted China, unraised his 12-gauge sawn-off shotgun, and he would fire right into China's chest, killing him instantly on his wedding days. And the rest was complete carnage. Pedro and his crew opened fire on male guests, sparing only women and children. And 7 men would be killed and 16 more would be wounded. And China's mother was actually hit, but Pedro would later say that was her own doing as she tried to shield her son. And after the massacre, the trio would just walk out the front door just calmly and confidently. And they would even go to a nearby bar to get a drink to celebrate. And from that day on, he was no longer just a teenage killer in the streets. He was now known as Pod Riven Homatador, which means Little Pete the Killer. And that name was everywhere. He was like a mythic figure, the boy who avenged his unborn child. It was like movie shit to people. The man who massacred an entire wedding party in the name of justice, and who claimed to be guided not by impulse but by a moral code. Sounds like somebody else we know. There were so many lessons in the vaunted code of Harry. So the wedding massacre would send shockwaves through the criminal underworld, cause 7 men lay dead, 16 wounded, and none of them were innocent in Pedro's eyes. But to law enforcement, it was a complete bloodbath. And after the wedding, Pedro didn't go into hiding. He just leaned into the myth. And he would actually go on to take up a pair of twins in a polyamorous threesome relationship and begin to live like a complete gangster, cause now he had gangster. Notoriety, money, and respect. And he even got tatted across his arms the words, "I kill for pleasure," which, oh my god, how is this guy real? And on the other, he'd add to the name Maria, and beneath it, it says, "I can kill for love." Like, who wrote this guy's lore? But Pedro claimed that he killed daily, and he would say, "I would summon the devil." It was a ritual. It was like, this body is yours, this blood is yours. Then he would find a man, someone who'd beaten a woman or prayed on the weekend. He would, drink their blood, because that's what he grew up thinking he had to do, just as his grandmother had once told him would make him stronger. But mere months after avenging Maria, another personal grievance would arise, and this time it would involve his cousin. Pedro would discover that his favorite female cousin had become pregnant, but his boyfriend disgracefully refused to marry her, and he would just abandon her and his unborn child. So Pedro, naturally enraged by the mistreatment of his cousin, took it upon himself to retaliate. They would hunt down the boyfriend and shoot him in the head in cold blood as punishment for dishonoring the family. Don't fuck with this guy, man. But in Pedro's eyes, this was just another righteous kill. The man had wronged his flesh and blood, so lethal vengeance was warranted in Pedro's mind, not mine. And this incident would just add to the growing tally of Pedro's victims, proving that no perceived injustice against his family would go unanswered, even relatively minor domestic ones. So Pedro's reputation would continue to grow, and he was now a fully wanted man, hunted by both the police and the death squads that we talked about before. But even the death squads kind of hesitated around P.I. driving home at a door, because his name carried weight and his reach extended farther than most knew. But luckily, legend is no shield and the myth doesn't protect against betrayal, because Pedro's inner circle began to unravel. His two buddies, the men who stood beside him at the wedding massacre, were both killed, one by police and one by a death squad. And though Pedro had kind of always lived as a loner, paranoia began to set in, unjustifiably so, because his twin lovers' father owned a bar in Sao Paulo, and Pedro would visit this bar pretty often. And one day while he sat drinking at the bar, the police would come in because the twins' father had tipped them off. So Pedro would be ambushed in a very dramatic raid. It was just a hail of bullets and screaming voices, and he was actually very badly wounded in the firefight, collapsing to the ground and starting to bleed out. He would pass out to the sound of officers yelling for his death. But when he woke, he was actually chained to a hospital bed surrounded by nurses, police, and television cameras. The vigilante killer was in and the myth had been subdued. And Brazil's most feared teenage executioner was about to enter a place even more violent than the streets, which was Brazil's prisons. So Pedro would spend 25 days recovering, shackled in place, before being transferred to prison. And the guards gave him a choice: either protective custody or Gen Pop, general population in the prison, where the friends, brothers, and sons of victims of Pedro's were waiting in wait. But Pedro didn't give a fuck, and he went to Gen Pop, which is crazy cause there's just lines of people waiting to kill Pedro. So he entered a system notorious for its brutality, overcrowding, and corruption, and where guards often handed over power to the inmates and violence ruled everything, like one of the scariest places you can go on earth, their blank car. And on the ride to prison, Pedro was chained inside the transport truck with another man, and this man was a serial rapist, just the lowest of the lowest of the lowest. By the time they got there, only one man was left alive in the back of the van. So from the moment he arrived, Pedro sent a message he would not be intimidated. And within days, 5 men tried to ambush Pedro in the yard. But when it was over, 3 word Edens ran off bleeding, and Pedro, he walked away, basically unharmed. Pedro had quite literally entered one of the most violent prison systems in the world, and he just made it his bitch, cause he would just turn anything into a weapon, spoons, wires, shiv-s, just his bare hands. And when he couldn't find a blade, he just relied on his fists or his specialty, breaking necks. How is breaking necks a specialty? That's a very hard thing to do. They make it look so easy in movies and stuff. They just go, that's a really hard thing to do, not that I would know, I just know because I'm not gonna talk about it, never mind. But to maintain this type of strength, to be a break-necking specialist, he would maintain his strength, daily punching the concrete cell walls, until they were slaked with his blood, also building his pain resistance like armor. And he would learn martial arts in prison, and he would lift homemade weights made from water bottles and broomsticks. But Pedro wasn't impulsive. Sometimes he would even befriend his victims, gain their trust, eat meals with them, even hug them, only to kill them months later once they were comfortable. He was just like a meticulous planner, like unfortunately, he was very smart, reminds me a lot of Ed Kemper in a way, like he was very patient and he observed and he learned. But Ed Kemper's just like a whole other stream, was not a vigilante, he's just a fucking monster. If you want to know more about that one, you go to this video over here, but anyway. Pedro stood on a pedestal, fucked up morals basically, but he believed in execution and not emotion. He didn't have regret after he killed somebody, and he didn't hesitate when he did kill someone. And in time, Pedro became the boogeyman behind bars. Other inmates feared him, guards learned to stay the fuck out of his way, and still he kept killing. So Pedro would just thrive in this environment, and he did so through murder. Bad guy, I cannot say enough, this is a bad guy, okay? I know I'm saying this like he's like, well dude, look at, well, this is crazy what he did, I mean. It's fucking crazy. This whole story sounds like it's straight out of a movie. It's not he's killing people, he's bad, he's a piece of shit. Or these bad people that he's killing. Maybe. Do they deserve to live? Probably not, but that's not for me to say, okay, and that's not for a human that has no just right to kill someone to decide, you know. So I'm just putting that out there. I'm just telling a story, a real story that's fucking insane, but anyway. Back in prison, not all of his killings were actually driven by revenge. And in one case that became folklore in the Brazilian press, Pedro claimed to have killed a cellmate simply because the man snored too loudly. Just it's like, you can't get on this guy's nerves, I swear, oh my god. But later he would clarify that the truth was much darker because during a hospital transfer, Pedro had shared a room with a prisoner who watched him too intently while he was being intimate with his girlfriend during a visit. And Pedro would say that he disrespected me, he stared, that's why I killed him. And he would have slit the snoring man's throat, probably also was a little bit because he was snoring. It was probably like too far for Pedro because he's crazy. And then there's Claudio the traitor. He was actually a former friend of Pedro who Pedro had actually protected on the inside. And Claudio was eventually released and welcomed into Pedro's family, and he would even begin a relationship with Pedro's sister. Good luck, dude. What the, don't do that. But after an altercation with Pedro's brother, Claudio shot and killed Pedro's sister Silvana. Run, actually don't run, I mean you're a piece of shit. You killed an innocent person, so you should go back to jail, but also run. So when Claudio would naturally return to prison for killing Pedro's sister, he expected some serious fucking vengeance for Pedro cause he's been around the block. So day by day would go by and he would just be looking over his shoulder waiting for Pedro to get his vengeance. Well, one day he did, because while Claudio was studying in his cell, Pedro would waltz in and he would grab him by the hair and cut through his throat with a knife, completely decapitating him. Pedro would go on to say, he was my friend, but I just had to kill him, I'm justified, which like he killed his sister, which again, he know killing is bad, killing is really bad, but what you poke the bear of bears. So as his infamy grew, Pedro began receiving letters from people on the outside begging him to kill specific inmates. He was becoming like a bounty hunter within jail. Anyone from rapists to child desayers or extortionists, men who had harmed the innocent scum of the earth, basically earth. And sometimes Pedro would oblige, but he did refuse to kill for money. So technically he wasn't like a bounty hunter, he was like a pro bono bounty hunter, I guess. But he evaluated each case meticulously to make sure that it was justified to do. So he was like a kind of a responsible killer. The morals are kind of all over the place. It's really hard, he's a bad guy, but so are rapists, you know. But in his own mind, if he deemed the man guilty enough, he would strike similar to Dexter. And sometimes he would beat them to death, sometimes he would stab them to death, and sometimes he would throw you down an elevator shaft. He never knew what was coming with Pedro, kind of a surprise guy. And he even described luring his victims into false friendships, kind of like we talked about before, sharing food, talking kindly before striking with absolute ruthlessness. I can't imagine just being like best buds with Pedro and just like skipping through the halls of prison and eating food only to get like a fucking sandwich shoved down my throat along with a fist. And Pedro would even go on to later tell an EV reporter about the day that he set a personal record of 16 people killed in one day. That he's 16 people killed in one day. The story is kind of murky and unconfirmed by public records. Will-key believe it after everything I've heard about him so far. But Pedro claimed that a prisoner spread a rumor that led to the death of Pedro's friend. In retaliation, he said he entered their ward and went on a stabbing spree, claiming afterward that he actually couldn't hear for 3 days from all the screaming. So whether true or mythologized, it fit the image Pedro had cultivated, a relentless executioner who claimed to purge prison of those he deemed unworthy of life. Guy was the Grim Reaper of prison. And his official body count was 71 confirmed kills at this point, but he insisted the number was much higher. And again, low-key believed him. So the state had given him a cell in Pedro, turned it into his killing fields. But it's just crazy to me that they didn't separate him from Gen Pop after he killed. I don't know, one person maybe to surviving it. He had been convicted at this point of 71 murders, with unofficial estimates claiming more. And for those deaths, both on the streets and inside the prison walls, Pedro was sentenced to nearly 400 years behind bars. His initial conviction alone was 126 years, and additionally killing inside prison pushed his sentence to well over 3 centuries. But in Brazil, sentencing wasn't so simple. Under the law at the time, no individual could actually be in prison for more than 30 years, no matter how many crimes they committed, which is beyond fucked up. So the rule meant that even a man who killed dozens could in theory just walk free after 30 years. So by 2003, Pedro had reached his 30-year mark. So he had technically served his time, and the authorities, just rattled by his infamy and the public outcry, scrambled for ways to delay his release. And through legal maneuvering, they extended his imprisonment for 4 additional years, citing his continued violence and danger to society. But they could not hold him forever, because there were now whispers of using a now repealed Public Security Decree 1 that allowed indefinite psychiatric confinement for those deemed mentally unfit. Pedro had after all been diagnosed by multiple psychiatrists as a psychopath, which he was incapable of remorse and driven by violent self-affirmation. But unfortunately, that loophole was gone, and by law, even Brazil's most prolific serial killers could be set free. And on April 24, 2007, after 34 years in prison, Pedro Rodrigues Filho walked, strolled, fucking danced out of prison, cause the system had done all it could, and it still wasn't enough. But the world Pedro had stepped into was unrecognizable. His technology had changed cities, had changed them, even the people looked different. Pedro didn't know how to ride a bus, use a self-own, or operate modern farm equipment. So the man who once ruled the prison yards had to ask strangers how to navigate everyday life. So Pedro would move into a small pink cottage surrounded by trees, reportedly located in Fortaleza in Ceará. and he would take a job as a farm caretaker, and he would acquire a Labrador and begin attending church, regularly attempting to reshape himself into something new, something more peaceful, trying to turn a new leaf, from killing nearly 100 people as you do. So at this point, there were no signs of violence and there were no signs of bloodshed. But yet even here, he wasn't entirely safe, cause enemies from the past caught wind of his release. And one day in Santa Catarina, a group of men would recognize him in public, and they went to gather reinforcements cause they knew they couldn't take this guy on, one-on-one or even 5v1 as we know from the prison yards. But Pedro would escape just in time and he would flee to his sister's house before they would return. But this time he didn't seek revenge, at least that's what he said. So but patterns be patterns and the peace wouldn't last. And on September 15th, 2011, at around 11:00, the police raided a farmhouse in Canberra. Are you acting on an anonymous tip? And Pedro just happened to be there and he offered no resistance. And officers would find a loaded .38 caliber revolver and illegal weapon and took him into custody. But this time the charges were different. He was accused of involvement in 6 prison riots during his earlier incarceration and for the unlawful imprisonment of a guard during one of them. And a possession of a revolver just added another charge to that list. And as reporters swarmed around the station, Pedro stood before the press and he was calm, measured, and very soft-spoken. And a reporter would ask him, "Do you think you've paid for your crimes?" And Pedro would nod slowly and say, "I've paid for my crimes." So he would hand his Labrador over to his neighbor and he would return to the one place that had shaped him more than any other, and that was prison. But this time he was sentenced to 8 years. So on December 6, 2017, Pedro, once known as Pod Riven Ho Metador, Brazil's most feared killer, was released from prison a final time. And he was 64 years old, but still looked younger than his years because a lifetime of prison workouts beginning at 4. Every morning had kept his body lean and strong. So the legend had aged, but the presence remained what seemed unchanged. And this time Pedro had claimed he was really different. He said that he no longer killed, that he did want peace, and that he just wanted to spend time with family, his family being his sister Clarice, his niece, Jacqueline, and her husband. And he would go to church, he preached about forgiveness, and he talked about a future that didn't involve violence. But he also admitted in interviews that the urge still flickered within him. He was allegedly asked if he still felt that temptation to kill, where he responded yes, but it fades away. And he said that the last time he killed was around 5 years earlier between his first and second release, but he wouldn't elaborate and he claimed that it was complicated. And with Pedro no longer killing allegedly, he had found another outlet, a similar one to what I found, which is fucking weirdend. That is YouTube, weirdend, that is YouTube. I didn't kill anyone though, so little bit of a difference there. The channel was called Pod Riven Ho X Matador, Little Pete the X Killer, just a great username. And Pedro uploaded often, sometimes, even several times a day with the help of a younger producer named Pablo Silva. And his videos were kind of a mix of anti-crime commentary, personal stories, culinary tutorials. Guy was a chef, motivational talks, footage of him getting tattoos, cooking or getting haircuts, and even warned kids about drugs, lying to their parents, and even vandalism, saying all of it was against his moral code. And he tried to just brand himself as a reformed man, telling people that crime does not pay him, does not pay. And his audience kind of grew and people recognized him in the streets and fans asked for selfies and even police officers shook his hand. And Pedro had become something previously unthinkable, which was a social media star. He really did turn a new leaf. And as his online presence just exploded, so did public fascination. And people drew comparisons between Pedro and, you guessed it, Dexter Morgan, a fictional serial killer from American television who hunted other murderers, other people who committed terrible crimes. And Pedro just kind of leaned into that comparison, and he reportedly said, "I only killed those who were no good. If I didn't kill them, they would kill me. And they would kill others who didn't deserve to die." And he continued to give interviews and even released an autobiography and would start collaborating with filmmakers and musicians, even appearing in a rap song about his life. But as he attempted to rebrand himself as a man of peace, he also covered up his past, like literally cause. He began replacing his old tattoos like, I kill for pleasure became a scorpion and revenge became love, and a crude devil tat became a tribal symbol, and an odd cross on his back transformed into Jesus and cherubs, and even Maria's name was covered with a feather. So he was literally trying to erase his past, but at the same time owning up to it with all of his videos. And he would even go on to list himself as single on Facebook, and in the comments women filled his post with hearts, roses, and marriage proposals. So Pedro, once the terror of Brazil's prisons, had become a brand. To some he was a completely redeemed man, but to others he was kind of a walking contradiction, and to many he was something even stranger, which was an icon. But then March 5th, 2023 would come. And it was a quiet Sunday morning in Mogi das Cruzes, a suburb on the eastern edge of Sao Paulo. And the sun had already begun to rise, burning off the morning fog that hung over the streets like a breath on a glass. And it was warm, humid, the kind of heavy air that sticks to your skin before noon. And Pedro Rodrigues Filho was now 68 years old. His wild youth was long behind him, and these days he was known more for cooking videos and crime commentary on YouTube than the trail of bodies he'd left behind. And that morning, he was visiting his sister at her home. And to neighbors, he was just a quiet old man who helped with chores and made strange, rambling videos online. But on that day, Pedro would walk out of his sister's house, possibly to get some air and then just enjoy the day. Maybe he was reflecting on the strangeness of still being alive after everything. And maybe he felt untouchable, having escaped countless ambushes, shootouts, and betrayals. And maybe he didn't feel anything at all. But what happened next only took seconds. A car would pull up to the curb, windows tinted, engine low, and inside were at least 3 men's faces hidden under hoods. And then the doors would fling open and the gunmen burst from the vehicle, and before Pedro could speak at all, move, or even raise a hand, the bullets would fly and the men would shoot Pedro in quick succession, close range, deliberate, and coordinated. And then Pedro would collapse on the sidewalk, bleeding out in the open air, just steps from his family's doorstep. But one of the killers wasn't finished and would step forward, kneel over Pedro's twitching body, and with a knife slash his throat so deep that police later say that it was tantamount to beheading. And the message was unmistakable: this was an execution. And the assailants would flee in the same vehicle, and tires would screech as they vanished into the narrow maze of city streets. And Pedro's neighbors, hearing the gunfire, rushed outside, and what they found was completely grotesque. A man just laid there, riddled with bullets, and his neck nearly completely severed, and his blood was just pooling in the gutter beneath him. By the time the paramedics arrived, Pedro was already dead. And in his final seconds, lying in the sun, lungs collapsing and heart slowing, it's hard to know what Pedro might have felt. Maybe shock, rage, recognition, or perhaps nothing. And perhaps, like he always said, death didn't scare him. It was just the cost of the code he had to live by. A killer who once claimed to kill only those that deserved it had been killed by the same fashion, clean, cold, and without mercy. And the murder bore all the hallmarks of a professional hit. And police immediately suspected, some speculated that it was retaliation from an old drug ring that Pedro had wronged decades ago, and others believed it came from one of the many families he'd shattered through his brutal brand of justice. But by mid-2023, 3 suspects had been identified, but no arrests had been made. And the killers had disappeared into the same criminal underworld Pedro once ruled. And so after surviving decades in the most violent prisons, escaping death squads, and outliving his enemies, the man who once declared himself invincible was gunned down on the street like so many of the men he had executed himself. So his story had come full circle. The vigilante killer had become the target of vigilante-style killing. Some say it was poetic and some say it was irony. But Pedro Rodrigues Filho will forever be remembered for the sheer number of people that he killed. By official records, he was convicted of 71 murders between the years 1968 and 2023, but according to Pedro himself, that number was conservative. He claimed the true count was well over 147. Of his confirmed victims were inmates, and most of them were convicted murderers, rapists, and thieves. And the rest included drug traffickers, gang members, and individuals he executed during his teenage vigilante years. And a handful, as we know, were personal. And at the end of the day, Pedro was diagnosed as a textbook psychopath. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, exhibited paranoid delusions, and possessed a chilling absence of empathy or remorse. And Brazilian psychiatrists even labeled him as the perfect psychopath. He could become intelligent and even charming, but underneath that surface was a man who had normalized murder as a way of life. And criminologists still Anna Kassoy even called him a rare Avenger-type serial killer, someone who built his entire identity around eliminating evil with pride in the evil, with pride in the precision of his kills. And Pedro's sharp memory and strategic cunning made him even more than just violent. He was calculated, and his background also played a role. He was born with that skull deformity caused by abuse in the womb. He was raised in a household full of chronic violence, learning to kill animals for food by age of 10. And experts believe the combination of head trauma and early exposure to brutality kind of shaped a brain that was simply wired to kill. So nature and nurture were clearly at play. And when debates arise over the ethics of vigilante justice, Pedro is cited as the most extreme example of what happens when one man decides he knows who one man decides he knows deserves to live or die. So was he a hero? Was he a monster? Was he a symbol of justice or a warning of what happens when morality becomes personal? The answer obviously depends on your perspective. But one thing is certain: Pedro Rodriguez Filho didn't just kill people. He forced a country and eventually the world to confront how thin the line is between justice and murder, especially when fiction and reality look so much alike. And that concludes today's video. I know it was a longer one, but my goodness, it was pretty crazy. I'd love to hear what y'all think down below. Very curious. I know it's just an all over the place case. I had not heard about him previously, and in reading about him, I'm just mind blown about it all. But anyway, I appreciate you being here and I appreciate the support, and I hope you'll stay safe and let me know what else you guys want to see down in the comments below. I do love reading your comments. Until next time, I will see your beautiful face. Okay, bye.